I was kind of resisting coming to Communist University with the Neanderthals because I was wondering what the Neanderthals really had to do with the class struggle. But the question about Neanderthals, did they have a symbolic revolution? It might help us to reflect on what exactly do we mean by the human revolution if we look at a comparative perspective, a comparative assessment, what happened with the Neanderthals against moderns. Do we have any good ideas about why there was a difference in behavioural, in the outcomes, fates of those two species? Neanderthals, of course, are very close cousins, the closest who were ever related to us, never mind chimpanzees. If you saw some of the news this week on the MIT DNA, mitochondrial DNA analysis of some Neanderthal, the Vindija bones of Croatia, that is suggesting a most recent common ancestor going back between Neanderthals and modern humans at 600,000. And that would have been an individual that would probably presumably be an African hominin called Homo heidelbergensis, living somewhere in Africa back 600,000 years ago, or 660, 700,000, that kind of time period. Basically, us and the Neanderthals have a very close parallel, and we're very close relatives. We looked even 400, 500,000 years ago, 300,000 years ago, you could find our ancestors in Africa and look at European ancestors, Neanderthals, and still they look very similar in some respects. So I don't have much truck with anyone who tries to make arguments about, well, the Neanderthals was basically a little bit deficient. They were a bit stupid, they couldn't speak proper, they couldn't join up their thinking, or they were all brawn and not they did their hunting by brawn and wrestling the animals to the ground rather than thinking, planning ahead. I don't think this is a good approach to think that Neanderthals are just deficient and somehow didn't make the grade. They coped in Ice Age Europe through a series of glaciations for a longer period of time than we have yet. As a species, their lifespan is, well, let's see if we have a lifespan of quite such a long period as modern humans compared to classic Homo neanderthalensis. So I don't have much truck with that. Instead, the approach will be through behavioural ecology. That is the science of animals' direct action on the world. The way they check their behaviour, because of the impact of environment, whether that's physical or social environment, the way that animals are changing their strategies, that is going to be affected by purely materialist considerations, time and energy considerations, fundamentally. And this would be the method, absolutely, that Marx and Engels, if they were alive, Chris was talking about Marxism and science before the break, Marx and Engels, if they were alive, would be absolutely pursuing this branch of Darwinism in trying to understand the key sort of features of human evolution. What was it that made us human? Why are we here? So my question is, why are we here but the Neanderthals aren't? And in particular, the issue of symbolic culture and the symbolic revolution. It is a big and controversial issue, symbolic revolution, because there are nowadays plenty of people that are prepared to stick their necks out with very well-grounded arguments that Neanderthals were doing quite a certain level of symbolism. So what can that mean if they weren't? And how does it compare with moderns? But in particular, if we're looking at this image, which is from the relatively late Upper Paleolithic, some 15,000 years ago, it's from a limestone plaquette, as something that could be readily carried around. Carved this image, females, women, dancing together. Somebody said dancing can't be science, I'm not sure about that. These lines being drawn between these PowerPoints of these women. That image is a cultural representation of some ritual, but it's specifically menstrual synchrony, something to do with, well, I'd say menstrual synchrony, but reproductive, something about women, the fertility, reproduction, being joined up, being joined together. This is modern human, and the Neanderthals never produce anything like this, that's for sure, although there are a few indications of some stuff going on there. But what that also represents is one of the basic principles that I need to get across to try and discuss this in terms of behavioural ecology. And I'm going to go back to basics with primates. We're talking about animals' use of their time, the resources of time, the resources of energy, with the basic Dawkins selfish gene viewpoint that what do animals do? They are aiming to replicate genes into the next generation. What the pure sociobiology selfish gene viewpoint focuses on is the difference between the sexes, because when we're talking about primates and mammals, the different sexes get their genes into the next generation by different means. And fundamentally, we can take a view of females, as we've got over there, as if they're kind of clocks, because what females have is this precious fertility, but it's very intermittent, it's rare in its occurrence. It's not there all the time. It's, of course, a very expensive process for females. By comparison with that, the males on this side of the screen are producing sperm day on demand, virtually. It's relatively cheap to produce, there's plenty of it, and actually a little bit goes a long way. If we take the understanding of females as clocks, and we can see how much difference females can make to their immediate social environment if they alter the levels of synchrony of their clocks of fertility. So if we go like that, if they line up fertile moments, then immediately what was happening before, where one male was able to pick and choose the different females at their different moments of fertility, and he was able to keep all the other guys out, well, as soon as females do that, then we're all lined up. There's several males brought into mating system, and if the females need the males for anything, then that might be good news. They might need them for protection, they might need them for getting food. On the other hand, it might be an absolute nuisance for them to have all these males in their system. But the main point is that females potentially, they have the mechanisms of being able to line up their cycles and being able to either bring males in, or alternatively, go back to something like that and throw the males out, so that only one male actually has access and need to hang around. So that's a basic principle of reproductive synchrony. That's just a theory. Does it even work? Well, amongst primates, many female primates, this tendency, the ability to synchrony, definitely exists. And it may operate through mechanisms of pheromones, so that, and it may also operate through kind of power structures, so that dominant females may be able to actually suppress reproduction in less dominant females if they have reason to do so. Alternatively, they may synchronize with them and sort of drive their cycles, which both things are possible. But we have plenty of field evidence, and this is an example from the field in wild chimpanzees, so one of our very closest relatives, our closest living relatives. And what's happening in this example is the synchrony of the females is when they are in synchrony, which is these black, so more than 2 estrus females in synchrony, this is just reproductive success, literally measuring fitness, the ultimate currency of evolution. It's somehow leveling right out. We're getting even the third rank, below the third rank, get almost as much look in as the top guy. Whereas if we have the females out of synchrony, the top guy is just monopolising completely. So that's real evidence, and actually some of the best fieldwork evidence for.
Could you just
explain a bit more. We've got, this is measuring in wild chimps, how these are chimp of the top rank, chimp of the second rank, chimp of the third rank, these are the males. How much of the fitness are they gaining? How much of the offspring are they actually siring? So this is done, they've done this with DNA tests, and we're able to track females' hormonal states, so they know which females are in estrus at the same time. Female chimpanzee estrus is very highly visible, and a male, particularly the dominant male, will be able to track very, very easily when a female is coming up to her most fertile time because of the big estrus swelling. And most often, a top-ranked male chimp will be able to follow and keep guard and be able to elbow the others out of the way at the moment when she's most fertile. But what the point here is that if several of the females are in estrus together, he's got his job cut out. He can't track this female A and female B and female C. And if that happens, then even the third and the lower ranked chimps get a look in. And in fact, they get so much of a look in that there's not a lot of significant difference between the top guy and the bottom guys there. Whereas if the females are out of sync, he's got 90%. It's a lot. Yeah. So that's the main message from that a fieldwork primate study on wild chimps. Okay. Now I wanted to say something about a real experiment, another real fieldwork primate study within one species called the langur, Indian langurs, the little temple monkeys that almost surely you've seen on TV programs at some stage. And these guys, some of you may know from reading around Darwinism, selfish genes, these guys are famous in Sarah Hrdy's study about infanticide. In fact, they were really used as an example that broke down what Rob Trivers called the group selection fallacy. Because Sarah Hrdy was particularly one of the observers recording the langur male's tendency to kill babies. A langur male who takes over the harem, so that usually they're living in harem, one male guarding his females, and the other males living as bachelor bands, and they come in to contest with that harem male. A new male takes over. His first act, almost his first act on taking over, is kill the babies up to a certain age of the females. And the females, of course, try to protect their babies. But generally it's a very, very difficult thing to do. If there's a big marauding male killing off the babies, what can they actually in the end do about it? And after their baby's been killed, within a very short time, they return to cycling and they will mate with that male who just murdered their baby. Now, the group selection people used to say that this was an example of males keeping control of the population, or the top guy had to keep control of the population so that there weren't too many babies eating out, and too many in the population eating out the available resources. So the top guy knows best, he's going to do the best for the whole of the rest of it. Yeah. Well then, how do you explain whether females fight back? How do you explain what is going on with the female resistance? So selfish gene people, of whom Sarah Hrdy is one of the main observers, were saying no, what's going on is that male is pursuing his entirely selfish strategy. He is trying to make sure that as many females as quickly as possible become available to him with their fertility. He's trying to change the clock of that female fertility. Okay, but langurs are not always and necessarily in single male harem groups. There is variability in the environment and variability in the way that females can affect the structure of social groups. And particularly, work done with the UCL primatologist Walter Summer has highlighted these two distinctive groupings. One group up at Ramnagar in Nepal with an Indian group at Jodhpur, very, very dry, arid environment at Jodhpur. Ramnagar also quite dry and driven very much by seasonal rains. And what the seasonal rains do is, by providing a great big flush of food at a certain time, it ensures that there are many females suddenly become fertile at a time in a certain season, basically after the rainy season, in time to that. And if those females are all lining up with their fertility, they're coming into season, they're coming to be ovulatory at that time, then we have this phenomenon of multi-male groups. The males all flood into the groups. One harem male, he just can't keep them out. What is very interesting about these little langurs is they actually don't show any sign of ovulation. It is not, quite unlike chimps who have big estrus swellings, langurs are much more similar to us. I'm going to show you the features for modern women today. They don't show at a particular point, a particular time of ovulation. And they can extend their receptivity when they're interested in having sex through a large chunk of their cycle for many days, 9, 10 days or more out of a cycle that's of the order of 28 or something days. Generally speaking, langurs do not show any sign of their menstruation either. They are menstruating, they're capable of menstruation, but in this group, they don't show any signal of menstruation. So they've basically got a cycle that does not pinpoint their timing of fertility, and they're making out that they're interested in sex through a large part of that cycle. And the effect of that is there's plenty of males around. Those males don't know when the females are fertile, so basically they're having sex with several partners. None of those males really knows, is the female fertile that day that I had sex with her. The result of all that is, I put RS, that means some of the subordinate males will get chances of getting females pregnant, not just the dominant males. So it spreads paternity amongst the males. And above all, there'll be very little infanticide. The males are confused about paternity. So we will not see examples of dominant males killing babies in groups like that. So the females are winning as far as infanticide goes, but actually these females suffer also because they've just got too many males around. And what the males are doing is eating their food. And what that means is they don't have enough food, they can't have babies as frequently as they might have if they have no food. So there's kind of costs and benefits in that strategy. They win by reducing infanticide, but they lose by the males eat them out of house and home. There is a constraint on it. They just can't escape the seasonality. And basically, they can't avoid the males flooding in when they're all fertile at that particular season. Now, what changes the situation in Jodhpur, this really arid environment? These females are also it's a very seasonal environment as well. But in this environment, they're getting fed. They get fed by the temple community, the ritual community, gives them extra food. And what that does is it changes the profile of the seasonality for the langurs. And they become, so that there's always some of them fertile at most times of the year. There's always some fertile females available, and therefore females that can be guarded by the males. They're all at different points of the year. And in those circumstances, one male is quite easily able to guard the whole harem. And in particular, the country's very open, it's very dry around Jodhpur, and that means one male is easily able to check out, oh, is anybody else coming to get him? No, and he can guard them. Now, what becomes really interesting is that we are talking about the very same species, but in these circumstances, where the females are non-seasonal and they have one male guarding them, they are actually helping him. They want just one male. They are doing the opposite of synchrony. They are staggering themselves so that male can just pop in for, keep guard of them for a couple of days, then, okay, finished, go to the next one, deal with her, okay, finished, go to the next one. They're helping him out. And they do it by, not actually by showing any sign of ovulation, they give a kind of cue with menstruation. They show when they're menstruating, which is implying, well, soon I'm going to be in line in the queue. And what it does is it makes sure that male is pretty clear he's the father of the offspring, which is fine as long as he's the male in charge. But of course, the big cost to that is if a new male takes over, he's going to kill the babies. Now, you would think that the females losing their babies is a very huge cost, and of course it is. With langurs, we're talking about 7 months of gestation and then a year more of looking after those offspring on breastfeeding. But the fact that there are not huge numbers of males around eating their food means that these females, despite suffering infanticide every few years, most years they're able to have more, they can manage to have more babies more regularly. So they actually end up with more babies. So in terms of fitness, this works in that environment. And what they have, that these guys don't, is the extra food that means they can level out. That food's coming to them from humans, it's not coming to them from any males or any langurs. What's so interesting about this is that we have this variability of the sexual signals and the ability by females to use those sexual signals and manipulate males with them in different ways, in different environments. That's within a single species. So never mind thinking about different species of Homo that might have different types of signals. Okay, that's fairly complicated, so I'm just using it because it's a framework within primate behavioural ecology that may help us to think about what could be the differences between Neanderthals and modern humans. I just made the claim that modern human female sexual signals have a lot of similarity, in fact, to langurs, to some extent. We are obviously completely different creatures. Langurs are little monkeys without any serious encephalization. We are extremely encephalized, with much larger body size, much larger brain size. But one key factor is that the concealment of ovulation in women's cycles, which is, or even if you don't entirely believe concealment, extremely unpredictable. Any man in this room who thinks he knows when even a partner that he knows well is fertile, I doubt it's true. Do men actually know when is the right time to have sex to really be that night to get pregnant? We are the past masters, women are the past masters scrambling the information. There may be a sort of signal warfare going on between the sexes where women are putting out all kinds of distracting signals of the way they walk or the clothes they wear just different. There's a lovely name for some of the hormones involved, something called copulines, which actually, quite contrary to what they sound like, well, they're meant to get men very, very interested in sleeping with you, but they're not at the time of ovulation. They're at other times. So it's like, at the time of ovulation, you're going to be pretty sexy. As some people may have heard about the lap dancers study, where lap dancers who are near ovulation, they tend to earn more money. Very materialist Marxist study that was. But copulines like even out the whole caboodle, so that men are picking up this signal at this time of the cycle, oh, that gets them excited, this signal at that time of the cycle, that gets them excited, so they're just being confused the whole time. But they keep trying to work it out, they keep trying to probe and find out about that fertility. This is men. What I am claiming is that design in our evolutionary past of concealing any real good information about when we're fertile exactly is highly similar to the design with the langur monkeys. That they had to, as a matter of life and death, conceal information about when they're ovulating so that the males who mated them didn't know, well, did I actually get father and offspring on that particular day? Paternity confusion. And it's highly likely that our evolutionary heritage is one of paternity confusion, which, notice, that is really attacking any kind of idea of pair bonding and monogamy, that is hubby and wife meeting up, keeping together, looking after the kids as the standard sort of evolutionary trajectory of humans. Paternity confusion may be a better bet for reasons that Chris was talking about with partner paternity. If you can kind of kid a couple of guys that they might be the fathers of the offspring, that could be a better strategy. So I've said that this is likely to be a very old feature in Homo's lineage. We'll just have a look in a minute at just how old that might be. A counter-infanticide strategy to confuse the males who's the actual father, give a couple, 2 or 3 males, the idea that he might be the father, then you'll have more men to protect, more males to protect the offspring. However, we are different from langurs, or at least some of the langurs, because we do have this very strong punctuating signal of menstruation, if we call it a signal. And menstruation pretty clearly marks out which females are not pregnant and those that are, or are pregnant or breastfeeding. Okay, so looking just back on, so this is a chart going back millions of years, back to 3 million years when we're talking about Australopithecines, and what it's measuring is brain size. And when we're looking at Homo lineage, it's coming in from 2.52, and we see a big jump in brain size. Australopithecines going up to Homo, basically twice the brain size from Australopithecines, who are roughly similar to chimps. Then it's pretty steady for a while, up to about 500,000 years ago, and this is the crunch time with us and the Neanderthals, our ancestors Neanderthals. That's where we have the same ancestor about 600,000 years ago. And again, it's accelerating upwards to a whole extra chimpanzee size, so it's 3 times what it was at the beginning of that lineage. So I would argue that issues of counter-infanticide, the costs for females of producing these large-brained offspring, already 2 million years ago, those early Homo, almost for sure, they were not showing accurate signals of fertility. I would argue strongly that concealed ovulation goes deep time into there. But then the question is, we were going to use this principle of reproductive synchrony. Does reproductive synchrony help? If different from langurs, humans and human ancestors, Homo, how did human females fuel this increasing brain size? They needed help from others to do so. No other living primate has managed to break through this 700, 800 cc brain size. It's been called a grey ceiling. And why not? Fundamentally because every other female primate, apart from ourselves, is doing the job by herself. She just doesn't have any help from males or anybody else much. But at this point, there must have been some help going on from others. There's got to be a social care system of some kind, cooperative breeding it's been called. And the major candidates for that are female kin, grandmother theory, plus and/or some help from males. Males beginning to get in on the act. But how can females get males interested in being in on the act, in helping raise, in helping provision? The concealed ovulation thing sort of helps. Imagine with the female clocks again, with our fertility moments where that arrow is pointing. Now, if all the females show their moments of fertility, but they're turning, their clocks are all lined up together. If the clocks are all lined up together, the synchrony principle says several males will come into the system. One male cannot guard all those females. The other males will get chances of fertility and be engaged in the mating system. But if the males know when that moment of fertility happens, they can, of course, kind of, right, we've done the job, right, let's go now, guys. We don't need to hang around with these silly females, let's go and look for some other females. Concealed ovulation plus lining the concealed ovulation up synchronously has a much better effect because you get all the males in the system, and the males, they still keep on hanging in there after the ovulation. They don't really know when, until, okay, the female's pregnant and she's breastfeeding down the road. But by that time, the male's kind of been sucked into a lot of extra help or protection or doing something that might be helpful for the females. So the combination of those two things, concealing ovulation plus synchronizing, in theory, it ought to bring males into the mating system. These are the kind of two mechanisms that, in our ancestry, may have been very useful for Homo females. And maybe going back deep time, to 2 million or so years, well before us and the Neanderthals. But there's a problem with that, because langur monkeys breed like once a year, if they're lucky, once 2 years, 1.5 years, but once a year if they're lucky. Whereas, of course, humans and our ancestors, particularly hunter-gatherer ancestors, it's a 3 to 4 year interbirth from having a child. A hunter-gatherer woman is then breastfeeding 2-3 years before she will start to cycle again, and then to get pregnant a year later, she might have the child again. So it's 3-4 year interbirth intervals as standard for hunter-gatherers. Now that's hunter-gatherers who have sexual division of labour, men supporting them. If we're talking about Homo ancestors, well, comparative to chimpanzees, a female chimpanzee by herself has a 5-yearly interbirth interval. She takes 5 years to get that by herself, up and running, that offspring. So we're looking at a starting point for Homo ancestors coming from chimpanzee size, brains, possibilities. We're looking at a starting point, 4 or 5 years at least, of interbirth interval. Now that implies, how can you keep synchrony like clockwork, like we were looking at right there? That all the females are kind of in together, like that. It won't work. One female, her baby dies soon after birth. Is she supposed to sit there with her legs crossed for like 3 or 4 years before the other guys all line up with their fertile moments? That's not going to work. She won't do that because it would be too detrimental to her reproductive success. She will she's not going to wait for the others to catch up with her cycle. She's going to go ahead with her fertile cycles, make some more males and have another baby. Maybe it'll be a year or 6 months or a year later that she'll start to have another child again. But that means that there's going to be some females giving birth every year. A cohort who are giving birth every year, and that cohort will spend 2-3 years breastfeeding before they're fertile again, maybe 4 or 5 years, 4 years later. So what this means is that a dominant male who's able to have a bit more success with the females for whatever reason, because he's bigger, because he's stronger, the kind of chimpanzee reasons that maybe he's good at making alliances, whatever that might be, he hasn't got all those females to guard, because not all of them are actually cycling. He can just focus on the guys that are cycling. And then maybe out of a group of females, that might be a third to a quarter of the females that will actually be cycling in any 1 year. And if all those females are cycling within 1 year, and we've just taken a sort of model here where you've got a random, so where I've put these little sort of squiggles, it's meant to be the few months when a female's actually cycling, which is menstruating and potentially fertile. If you spread them out through the whole year on a random pattern, actually, that dominant male, okay, he starts off with this one, then maybe another male's going to find that one, but then he can go to that one, he's finished with the first one, he can go there, and then maybe there's another male got taking care of that one at the top, but then he can find the next one. So he's still having a pretty high success rate. He's still able to follow through maybe 2, 3, 4 females in a year within just 1 year period. So this thing of the dominant male gets much more reproductive success is maybe going to still pan out, even in early Homo. What we argued in a paper quite a while back is that could be kind of held at, that could be kept in check if the females were very strongly seasonal. If most, I've put it as a very tight seasonality, so that's at the beginning of the year, females tend to be cycling, maybe because it's the rainy season, just like the langurs. Rainy season, females are cycling, and in those circumstances, our dominant male, well, he really has to fight, he has to pick one of those females and stick with her, which means there's going to be at least a couple of other males in that system, at least. And then they've got to wait until a year later before some more females come on tap. So basically, in a seasonal system, any one male is going to have his work cut out to find more than one fertile female in a year. Okay, that would be good. What could make it better is if each of those females, she wasn't putting up with just one male anyway. You know, one male's not good enough. You know, you want to have sex with me, okay, but you've got to put up with this other guy too. So if each of those females is pulling a couple of guys, which is how I played this particular game, then you've got more males. You double up the number of males in the system. And you're doubling up the chances, several of those males, maybe not quite as many as I've got N females there, maybe not quite as many males as females, but you've still got quite a few in the system. But what is radically different between these two scenarios, in the random pattern, where there's no seasonality, dominant males, this is what these graphs are about, it doesn't really matter. In the random pattern, dominant males have so much potential fitness tracking through the females who come, they're fertile for a few months, right, I'll go with her. When she's finished, right, I'll find her. When she's finished, I'll find the next one. They have so much success with that there's no way that they're going to kind of start behaving well, settle down, look after this female, and stay with her until her baby's in a good health and welfare, and then they'll move on to the next one. That's not going to happen. But in this pattern, what our model was showing was that it becomes worth it, even for a top male that gets all the females saying, yeah, come on, come on. If he's only got one female a year, basically, to bet on, he might as well stick with her and help her out. It becomes a better deal for him in terms of survival of his offspring against the other possible chances he might have. Then it's worth him actually staying on. I made a model where it's worth him just staying on through the first year of the offspring's life, just to hang out and see that offspring got off to a good start. So there's a radical difference between what males should do in terms of offering extra care if they're doing a seasonal pattern compared to if the females are in a random cycling pattern. That's the main message there. So where does this take us to Neanderthals? Some people might be able to see where this is going to go. I'm now going to go to Homo heidelbergensis, our ancestor and the Neanderthals' ancestor, and run through the female cosmetics coalitions theory, which is the sex-right theory of the human revolution, a little bit with that, and say what happened to our ancestors, and then start to talk about Neanderthals, why it was different with them. Okay, so the main point is, whilst the brain size is fairly steady, 0.5, half a million, up to about there, maybe females were just able to carry on with their help from their mums, their kin, plus the males turning up at the time when they might be more fertile. Males would be particularly interested in turning up when females were cycling, and of course that is just the time when a female has a weanling. She's trying to wean her latest offspring, so if the male is hunting for her at that time, giving her some presents at that time, that's very good news for the weanling, that child should get some survival. That's okay here. But what happens there is this very rapid increase of brain size. And that's when females had to get the males to start doing some serious work. And in the archaeological record with Homo heidelbergensis, we start to get the signature. For instance, they find beautiful hunting spears, sites in Germany, also Clacton in Essex. Where it's quite clear that some of those, even Boxgrove in Sussex, they've been hunting some seriously large animals already at that stage, from 500,000. Okay, let's just go back, just run through what's the cosmetic coalitions theory saying. We have concealed ovulation. The males do not know the actual moments of fertility, but menstruation is like a flag of not on fertility on that day, but it flags which females are the non-pregnant ones. So it is information that no male can possibly ignore in a selfish gene world. in a Darwinian world, all males are very interested in tracking which females are menstruating, because that means those females are the ones you want to bring her flowers, you want to bring her chocolates. Those are the females that you want to butter up. And a dominant male, a philanderer type male, well, this is the dynamic of what's going to happen. With a bunch of females, only a third or a quarter of those females, and then some older females, so maybe a fourth or a fifth of those females is liable to be cycling at one time. All the males are interested. All of them are interested in what's going to happen. Not all the males may be able to do something about it. Some of them may be much more subordinate to others. But what the problem is now for females, menstruation not only gets these males in competition with each other, it's got the females in competition with each other. That menstruating female, she may want to have some sexy philanderer guy who's going to get her a really nice sexy baby. And these other cycling females, the non-cycling females, I'm sorry, they're pregnant, they're lactating, they need the energy. They're the ones who need males to help them out. And all these males getting distracted by this scarlet hustle here. So what do they get? The female, it's down to the females. This is near as we're going to get to class struggle here. It's sex is the class struggle. Down to the females to resist. They've got two basic options. Well, first of all, they've got to get control of that female. They can't just let any of these males waltz in and take her off on safari. This is not a good idea. For one thing, she might be a relative of theirs. She's likely to be a sister, daughter, niece, something like that, if we go with the grandmother hypothesis. So they can't let the males get any control of her. They've got to get control of her. They then have two options. These are the two options we're going to explore. That's the modern human version. We're pretty sure that this is what modern humans did. They, instead of allowing the males to pick and choose between menstruating females and non-cycling females, they also said, they spread the signal and said, we are all menstruating, look, we're all sexy, what are you going to do about it? You can't pick and choose any one of us. If you want to come near any of us super fantastic, sexy, fertile females, you've got to do something about it. Get some, bring us some flowers, bring us some chocolates, bring us some nice fatty meat. This is the picture of that female cosmetic coalition ritual, proto-ritual, if you like, in action. This is the full ritual symbolic form of it amongst people who aren't hunter-gatherers, they're the Hindu in Namibia. But they are just showing what the effect of that is. To spread a signal as if menstruation, or even as if anti-menstruation, is as if they're just spreading the signal evenly amongst all those females. No one female. How is it possible for a male to come up to this line and say, oh, well, no, I think you're not menstruating, you really are menstruating, so I'm going to, come on, Missy, come with me. It's not going to happen, because the signal that's actually coming across here is not so much about fooling the males, it is about showing we are a coalition in solidarity. This is where it goes to that costly signal idea, demonstrating costly signal of commitment within that female coalition, but also demonstrating the costly signal of the quality of the female coalition. And my argument is that the males who buckled down, who read the message, they didn't take it literally. They read the intention behind the message. The intention behind the message is, we are a super collective, together bunch of females. You hunt for us guys, and we will raise you fantastic babies, because we have the kinship network to do it with. That's the signal that's being gone across, and the Hindu are doing it in their way to do it. And just to very quickly run, we've told the story of the human revolution here before. This is a testable model. We have the earliest evidence of symbolic behaviour. It's going to come up in the cosmetics industry of red pigment. The hypothesis, the theory, is being driven by encephalization rates, so that the amount that females are under selection to produce these larger brained babies, because those large brains are so energy expensive, they require so much work from the females in terms of lactation, in terms of producing kilocalories, literally. then we say that has to start happening in the time period when encephalization gets very, very steep. It's got to happen from 500,000 years ago up to about the time when modern humans are fully modern humans, 150,000 years ago, brain sizes actually start leveling off, really. We've got a whole set of predictions, which Chris and I have talked about sometimes before. The wrong species, wrong sex, wrong time. The jokes, turning everything on its head. This is the prediction about symbolic culture emerging as a result of those female sexual signals. Okay. So I'm just running through here very quickly to show you how well those predictions, especially I'm looking at the first two predictions, cosmetics industry and red pigment, and the time period. And we just look at that chart, I'll run through the others quickly. Our timeline on ochre pigment is in Africa at least 300-year depth. With a regularity, there's this new site at Pinnacle Point that fits in 160. The actual earliest modern human specimens at this stage dating just after 200, 160. So we've got ochre going deeper than actual speciation of modern humans, but from the time of speciation of modern humans, it's really, in Africa, it's there more often than it isn't. It's becoming very regular. And before 100,000, we've already got examples of symbolic artifacts of jewelry. These are shell bead necklaces at these sites, up in Palestine School, right on the rim of Southern Africa, site in Morocco, Tafraout. So in North Africa and South Africa, all the way with this material. And of course at Lombos Cave, large quantities of ochre cupboards. This is the tip of ochre artifacts and pigment through this sequence from 70 to 140,000 years ago. These are some of the famous examples of what is given credit as the very earliest world's definite kind of artifact, symbolic production, world's first art, with the engraved pieces of pigment and ochre, this kind of design being rubbed into, being etched into these pieces. And this material doesn't look very red on its surface, but this is hematite. It's a rich red iron oxide. And these photographs, of course, from Ian Watts, our colleague, who's done the work. Ian's main work in the analysis of the ochre has focused on there were other pigments potentially available. Ochre does not only come in red, it could also come in yellow. You could also use black pigments that might preserve in the artifact, in the archaeological record. But Ian has argued that the ochre materials and pigment materials gathered by the South African, we're talking about Lombos Cave and other Pinnacle Point, other South African sites, is overwhelmingly, it's over 80%, 90% in some places, is red. It's a very strong focus on red, which has been his main argument against people who've tried to say, well, the ochre is being used for other utilitarian uses, not for symbolic or display uses. And the point of that graph is to say that the more curated, the more attention, the more that's been done to a particular piece, has it been honed down into a crayon, for instance, has it been etched with engravings, the more likely that piece is to be a deep red, strong red, vivid colour in its production of pigment of ochre. We have some more. This is just to show, that's not very well reproduced, but to show the grinding of pigment. It's an intensive, it's labour-intensive work done here by a Himba girl, and it is something that really women do much more of. Grindstones of ochre are found in the African archaeological record back to of the order of 300,000 and certainly 200,000 in speciation. So there's no question about it going on. And we see the use of the Himba women there, the shells, which is very interesting compared to the shell necklaces that have been found in the 100,000-year-old record. There's a different species of shells, but the shell necklaces that have been found, Nassarius shells, quite small little tick shells, they are coloured with ochre. And we can see from this picture why those shells would be. If you are covered in ochre all over your skin and you're wearing the shells, then you pick up those pigment pieces. And this is the sexual signals. My main plank of argument with the female cosmetic coalition theory or sham menstruation theory, this is about sexual. Sooner or later, the men they want these females to be doing these sexy dances. They want females who can do this stuff. They don't want females who aren't putting on the ochre in the. They want these ones. They want these guys, and you can see why. Okay, with female cosmetic coalition theory, we've got our predictions. They're testable predictions. We go to the archaeologists. We say, you could really test these. You could test them in ethnography with myths and rituals. There isn't another explanation, Darwinian explanation, out there for why there is the ochre in the record, especially in the African record. So we think we've got an answer to it. But what they come back and say is, well, what about the Neanderthals then? Because if our model is driven by encephalization, the Neanderthals, everybody says Neanderthals have as large or larger brain sizes than our ancestors. So why don't female Neanderthals have just the same problems of energetics, that they're trying to raise these very large brain babies? They need lots of help from the males. They need to get the males sticking with them, hunting, supporting them. So what difference would there be that could cause a different outcome? Okay. So I don't see why, for instance, these first two predictions of our model should surely apply to the Neanderthals also. We should see evidence of cosmetics industry with red pigment, the Neanderthals, and it should correlate, assuming that we can confirm the brain size increases at roughly the same time period, then it should correlate with that. Unfortunately, the Neanderthals are not here, or their descendants aren't here, and with Neanderthal hunter-gatherers to tell us anything about their rock art or their myths or their rituals. So we can't test that, but we can test these first two ones, definitely. So what we're just first quickly going to go and do is compare what we saw, when I just showed you a bit of in Africa. What does it look like in Europe? So I said in Africa it goes back at least 300,000 with ochre. And this is Ian Watt's analysis. From 250,000 years ago, somewhere in Africa, you're going to find some ochre, always. There'll be some somewhere. It's like a continuous record. And that's despite the fact that the African continent has been to an order of magnitude less researched than all the archaeology that's been done on Neanderthal sites in Europe. Okay? So you can find it somewhere, we've hardly looked yet. From the time of speciation with Homo sapiens, about 150 to 200,000 years ago, from the time of our common African ancestor, African Eve, if you want to call it that, we have ochre there all the time, pretty much. And wherever modern humans, and just remember this, it takes modern humans 100,000 years to bother leaving Africa. They're not bothered to leave Africa for 100,000 years, they're quite happy where they are. But when they do, when it's the L3 DNA lineage that actually gets out there, wherever they go, they take red ochre with them. It's like the species marker. Okay? So it really is a Homo sapiens thing. It should be stressed. We're talking about symbolic culture in Africa 2 or 3 times longer than it's been anywhere else on the planet. It's very old in Africa. But what about Eurasia? Is that true? Now actually, when you start looking at the pigment record in Eurasia, I'm saying Eurasia because it's not only Europe, it's sites in France and Czechoslovakia and Holland, but also in India. So India wouldn't exactly be called Neanderthal, but we could call it Homo heidelbergensis. From about 250,000 years ago, you get a crop of cases where you've got hematite, ochre, cropping up. So actually, you could say, and some of the pro-Neanderthal people who want to prove Neanderthals were really every bit as clever and capable as moderns, they're saying, well actually, it's about the same time depth, in fact, as moderns. It really is. then a big difference, because for about 100,000 years ago, from 200,000 or just before, there's nothing. We don't really find anything much to talk about. And I'll have a look how that looks when we look at the climate chart as well. Then there's a piece that I'll show you in a moment called the Tata plaque, which comes in at about 100,000 or just before. So we've got a big difference. There's a big difference between the Eurasian record and the African one. And then it takes a little while to get going, but what's mostly interesting, particularly, is the well-researched French sites in Dordogne and southwest France, of Mousterian, that is Neanderthal industry, that comes before modern humans come and invade Europe, if you like. And I'm using that word carefully because I don't think it looked anything like an invasion. Modern humans come into Europe about a little before 40,000 years. And we're talking back to 60, 50,000 years before there's any modern humans around. We do have a considerable amount of pigment being used. I'll show you some but it's not red, it's black.
It's what though?
It's black, it's manganese dioxide, which is a black powder. It makes powdered pigment with black, it looks chocolate.
What was you using the KYA?
Sorry, KY is just 1,000 years ago, I'm just putting 1,000 years ago. So 250,000 years ago. Would be 250,000 years ago. Sorry, not being consistent. Okay, so our main difference is starts roughly the same time. There are nowhere near as many sites, but there are quite a few. There's clusters. There's a few. It's got some archaeological consistency. There's a big gap where in Africa it's continuous, and then it's kind of late in the day. And when it gets going, there's actually a bit more, rather more black than red, though there is still some ochre, and especially in what's called the shadow crane. I'll talk about it. Okay, so we've got some kind of comparison of a record, a cosmetics record, maybe. This example of the Tata plaque I pointed to is about 100,000 years old. It's quite a remarkable and enigmatic piece for anybody who's interested in the symbolism of the Neanderthals. It's made of a great big mammoth molar, and it's been really flattened and polished down beautifully. I think Chris maybe wanted to know. And it's then been covered, it's been patterned with ochre. So it smacks of being an object that has some purpose, it's costly, curated, beautiful, smacks of something that might have been involved in ritual activity. But it's very enigmatic as like one type of thing. There's another interesting piece of Tata, that's a Hungarian site, a little over 100,000 years old. Okay. And that's the piece that comes in at the end of the big long gap where there's not much going on at all. Okay, is it true that Neanderthals had the same brain sizes as us? Would they have had the same? This is where we're going into the energetics. Did Neanderthals need the same amount of time, energy to do their daily business, to get the food they needed to be able to survive and reproduce? If you look at the fossil data on brain size through time, and basically it is absolutely the same. The rates of brain increase, the sizes of the brain sizes through time, it's just the same. There's no much big difference. What is different is perhaps what's called robusticity, just sheer body size. So encephalization is about the size of brain compared to body size and body weight. Late in the day, after 100,000, modern humans become very what's called gracile, relatively very light boned. Our skull's extremely delicate and thin compared to Neanderthals. But it really happens late in the day. Even back before this, modern humans are rough, tough, strong, robust skeletons. However, brain size doesn't look different, but body size and shape in Neanderthals is a big difference from us. And most especially, this is going to make a difference of energetics. Neanderthals built like brick ship houses. They are just across the chest, vast barrel ribs, incredibly muscular. Whether it's male or female, the shoulder bones, the arm bones here are really grooved with the musculature. Incredibly big, gripping, grasping hands. Their body weights are sheerly bigger, which implies that they just need more energy to run those bodies. and to be able to find the food to be able to fuel those bodies. And various people modelling Neanderthal energetics have focused on, one, the bigger body size, two, the shape. They're very short, relatively short, stocky limbs, believed to be part of adapting to cold environments, because they would have been living in European environments in ice ages. Those short limbs also mean that Neanderthal locomotion may have been less energy efficient than our longer limbs strolling around the African savannah locomotion. We're very well designed for efficient walking long distances. Other aspects of cold adaptation mean that they may have had to raise BMR, there is basal metabolic rate. They just, the overall calculations by all these modelers is highlighted as probably Neanderthals needing at least 10% extra kilocalories every single day, 10% extra. They're looking at a range of, for females, 3,500 plus to 4,000 kilocalories, males upwards of 5,000 to 6,000 kilocalories. And the analogues that they're using to compare with Neanderthals would be either Arctic hunters or perhaps Tierra del Fuego Indians, who are also built on a very big, broad scale as part of cold adaptation. The amount of food and energy required to fuel them in those really cold environments is considerable. And there's a whole bunch of archaeologists who have been, particularly Will Robrooks, who's at Leiden University, Dutch archaeologist. They have looked at how this Neanderthal energetics requirements affects what we are likely to see in the archaeology. This means that Neanderthals will have different solutions to moving about their environment and the way they use their environment, because they've got these big, strong bodies that are quite hefty, and they do not want to they do not necessarily efficiently travel long distances every day. So what that might mean, for instance, is that if they make a camp, they will go kind of short distance out of that camp, eating out a fairly short radius around that camp, and then they'll have to move quite quickly. Whereas modern human idea might be to have your camp and to travel long ways from that camp and to spend long ways travelling. Now what the difference will be then is that whereas Neanderthals will be shifting base very frequently, modern humans will be more likely to stay in a base camp and kind of move out from there. So you're going to see a lot of difference in the archaeology. Neanderthals aren't going to be bothered to make fancy campsites with beautiful hearths and structure their beautiful shelters here, because you're moving so soon. So you may be having a number of places in your landscape, and you move in there, and then you move on to the next one. You're just not going to want to kind of go to IKEA, fit it all out with beautiful curtains. It's not going to happen. So all these people who all this time have been thinking, well, the Neanderthals, they're just too stupid to make their houses properly. It's not that. It's just they're living in a different, using the landscape in a different way. They're no good at interior decoration. Well, no, actually, it's because they're moving about much more frequently. So this can explain a lot, very neatly, a lot of difference between the archaeology that's perceived of moderns when they come into the European environment compared to the archaeology of Neanderthals. I'm not going to get into too much detail on that, because I want to just focus on the female reproduction. And I can bring this down quickly to the end. We're talking about Ice Age European environments. Particularly, I'm going to focus on that 100,000-year gap, which would have been the penultimate glacial, the glacial cycle of from 190,000 years ago. In that time period, the classic Neanderthals emerged out of that glaciation, having become very cold adapted. At the time that modern humans were speciating in Africa, Neanderthals were going through this very long cold time in Europe. Of course, they wouldn't have been where the glaciers were. They would have come down towards the south, pushed down by the ice. They would have been dealing with tundra and very glacial environments for their strategies. Now, what I'm arguing is that no human species, no Homo species, up to that point would ever have been so seasonal as Neanderthal females in those environments. this data is just looking at seasonality of births. So these are months. These are births by month here. These are tiny months. This is looking at hunter-gatherers living, Bushman hunter-gatherers during this big in oxygen isotope stage 6 with the glaciations that produced cold-adapted classic Neanderthals would have been at least like that, if not bigger. We'd be talking about coming out of winter, really lean, females completely infertile, needing the spring, summer to build up any kind of reserves, nearly all of them becoming fertile towards late summer, towards this kind of time of year really. And so we're talking about significant seasonal synchrony. So this is cutting to the chase, and why that is going to have, if you have a profile of reproduction with a female cycling like that compared to like that, I'm basically arguing Neanderthal females were much more like that, whereas tropical African females were much more like that. And this means where Neanderthal males are concerned, his chances of sticking around with more than one female in a year are very unlikely, because he's got to kind of stick with his female when she's likely to be fertile around mid-late summer. This is something that we know from Inuit, Eskimo experience, that populations break up in kind of pair bonds through the summertime before people come back together in wintertime in big collective camps. And what we're saying is seasonality. I'm saying there's a seasonality thermostat going to operate here that will overlay the model of the female cosmetic coalitions that we've already argued. During ice ages, during glacial cycles, males can't behave badly because the females are kind of lining up seasonally, and there's one female there that's available to a male each year. In those conditions, similar to what we modelled, it just begins to pay, even the males that are trying to philander, even those kind of top alpha males, it just pays them to stay home and look after the kids a little bit. There's always a little bit. Less male philandering in the ice ages. But then what happens if we're going through a period of climate shifts through that whole time of Neanderthal evolution. I'll go on. Let's just show the ice ages there. Sorry, it's a bit dim. This is measuring oxygen isotope stage. Where there's peaks here, that is signifying it gets very, very warm. Those dark bits, the peaks, where it's peak, is signifying that it's getting seriously warm. In fact, that peak there, 125,000 years ago, there were hippopotamuses in Trafalgar Square. It was that warm. Whereas these troughs down here are where it's really cold, very dry, glacial, Arctic type conditions in northern central Europe. This is the oxygen isotope stage 6 I was talking about, where it really goes blank for 100,000 years, and you can see that's really that's dipped down, right down, very cold. If we just run the pigment record of the Neanderthals, the prediction is that when it's very cold and dry and ice age, they're not interested in cosmetics because the males are behaving themselves. They don't need cosmetics. But what if it switches? What if you switch from, this is oxygen isotope stage 6, before 250,000 years ago, and you've got this big dip before 250,000 years ago, and then it comes back up, and it really switches quite quickly, 250,000 into a warm bit. that's where we have this cluster. There's quite a few examples of use of hematite, and I mean use of hematite. It's not just any old bits of ochre, it's bits of ochre that have been ground and picked up. There's bits in India, there's bits in Czechoslovakia, France, Holland, quite a nice site, there's several pieces there. And that's this period. And then after about 190,000, it starts really going down. So the period with the blank of nothing being found is pretty much correlated with that. Okay. Now then it starts to get a bit messy, and I look a little bit. Our Tartar plaque, that famous piece from Hungary, is coming. I'm going in a bit more detail. So when it's very warm, when the spikes go up, it's cold when it dips right down here. And unfortunately, it's got a bit, it has cut off. So the very, 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 very warm bit goes there. And we would really expect that out of that ice age, oxygen isotope stage 6, when it suddenly gets as warm as like Trafalgar Square has hippopotamuses, they ought to start using cosmetics. There is some tentative evidence in one of the Worcesterian sites, Combrenal, that might correspond to that. There's a bit of an argument about that Worcesterian site. The Tartar plaque, though, is coming in at one of these very warm peaks. This theory will best be tested on sites like Combrenal, which are listed. They're very well researched French archaeological sites with excellent data on the climate levels, each archaeological levels, and I can track where they found bits of ochre in those levels against what the climate was like at the time. And I haven't yet got a diagram that's showing it, but basically when they get relatively warm, you see there are some warm bits coming after. There's a big cold bit, that's 70 to 60, there's some warm bits going on between 60 and 50, particularly around 50. You can place the ochre into the relatively mild times. The trouble is the picture is a bit messed up by, especially Pêche de la Zé is a site that shows it. We're looking at Pêche de la Zé materials, Worcesterian pigment, but that is manganese. It's black. It doesn't fit my picture. We can argue about why that might be so. These, no question about it, are beautiful pigment used crayons. Francesco Derrico has argued about it. And he can demonstrate how beautifully they make marks on the skin and so forth. Abraded pigment, manganese dioxide. Pêche de la Zé is focused on a relatively warm period of time, about 50,000 years ago. But there are other places with manganese where it isn't that warm. However, what it looks like to me is that suddenly the Neanderthals are kind of kicking it, having been started it, then it all went dead for 100,000 years, then it starts to crop up again in that few warm bits of the interglacial of stage 5. It goes down a bit again in the cold bit of stage 4, and then with sites like Pêche de la Zé, it starts to go. We start to get evidence that really looks like, you can't look at that and look at the African material and say, well, if we think there's ritual going on in Africa, well, sorry, but what are they doing here? Looks just the same kind of stuff, but it's black. All right. The shadow Peronian is the final stage of sort of very enigmatic stage, which is believed to be the contact of moderns and Neanderthals. The moderns come in just about 40. The actual dating is subject of huge controversy. So this is a timeline saying time of contact 42,000 absolute years. This is all about carbon calibration here. Possibly, some people argue that shadow Peronian was in the time just before the modern humans came in, and some people say, no, the Neanderthals weren't that clever. They had to get it from the modern humans. The modern humans came in and then they started copying them. But people like Francesco Derrico, very much on the side of the Neanderthals, as I am. Examples from Cansay's site, Arcy Secure, with Chalcopyronian beads, beautifully manufactured beads, in a Neanderthal autonomous style, he argues. And in fact, he says, the Neanderthals, when the moderns came in and saw Neanderthals making those cool fox teeth beads, they started copying them, actually. From my point of view, the Chalcopyronian is interesting because they get a lot of red again. Having done the manganese, they start doing the red again. Well, Francesca would say, no, they've still got manganese, but they get very hot on red again. And what that's saying to me, it kind of doesn't matter whether the Neanderthals were picking it up off the modern humans, or whether they were already starting to do it in response to climate. They could the signals worked. And it's kind of, it makes me feel the Neanderthals and the moderns can talk to each other a little bit ritually through those signals, and there are plenty of people willing to argue rather than this kind of sensationalist idea, Neanderthals killed off by rampaging modern invaders from Africa. Actually, they would have had plenty of ground for being able to trade and signal to each other, even if they weren't talking the same language. And ultimately, I'm going to skip on language, we can talk about that, why that matters. Ultimately, if Neanderthals are finally getting their symbolic strategies as a regularity, I do not doubt that there was linguistic communication going alongside that. I think it's very strongly likely indeed. The final point to make, which comes out of the Langer example of those different use of sexual signals, is that the model, the female cosmetic coalition model, works on that basis. It's being driven for materialist reasons of energy, requirements of females within civilization. And civilization pushes it. Females have to resist the problem of male philanderers who are going to try to pick and choose the imminently fertile females, the females who are menstruating, whilst non-cycling females get left out. Those non-cycling females pursue, and I've said, one or two options are possible. Either you confuse the menstrual signals by using ritual to big them up, to amplify them and exaggerate them and show yourselves off, or, and this is the road that the Neanderthals would have been going down a lot of the time because of the Ice Age, because of the seasonality. You actually, if you're relying on seasonality to keep the males in check, you don't want to let them know about menstruation. You've got to hide it. Because if they can spot the menstruation, at least you don't want anybody else except your hubby. Hubby can know. In fact, you might want him to know. But you do not want to let any of those other guys know, or it'll wreck the system. So Neanderthals keep squashing it, whereas modern humans dig it up and send the signal. But when it gets really warm and the climate changes, everything goes into reverse for the Neanderthal. Suddenly they are able to have babies through larger periods of the year, and then these menstrual signals are there and the philandering can start. That is when they would have been pushed kind of late in the day into, they kept coming back to try again to produce that revolutionary signal. In the end, I think they got it, but it kind of got squashed for a long, long period. And maybe the black, I can't explain the black, other people can try and help me with that. Maybe the black is because red is just scary, and the black is like a sort of non-red.
Blood can look black sometimes.
Yeah, yes. There's been arguments about the colour, but maybe we can discuss that a little bit. But that's about it.
Thanks very much.
Neanderthals is just crazy stuff, because in both cases, for both species, we're talking about few thousands of population. Think of the population of a small town in Devon in the whole of Europe for both species. If you want to get out of the way of somebody, if one species was getting a bit aggressive, then the other species simply run and hide. They would just get out of the way, which is what hunter-gatherers always do. Hunter-gatherers never stand and confront and fight people unless they absolutely have to. They always just move out of the way. So this idea that there's some sort of invasion army of modern humans is a crazy idea. is sensationalist I don't really want to go down the road of doing a big defence on out of Africa. I mean, we can argue details, but I didn't do this as an out of Africa defence. I'm going with the basically out of Africa, probably on one entry route, going around the Indian Ocean and into Asia before coming up around Black Sea and so forth, or up through the Middle East as well. So I don't too much want to go down that because it's going to take away from the rest of the discussion. There's a problem with Neanderthals and moderns as being, they are given different species names. This is the convention Homo neanderthalensis, Homo sapiens, because they are such recognizably in the fossil record. You can say, yeah, that's a Neanderthal, yeah, that's a modern or a modern human ancestor. It's recognizable. But I think there's a very strong, I mean, bonobos and chimps, who are much more widely separated, can certainly have sex and breed and produce offspring, maybe hybrid offspring. I think there's very likelihood that biologically there wasn't a big barrier, that really there isn't a species barrier between Neanderthals and moderns. But what would have been much more likely to be a barrier would be for cultural, well, for reasons of the scarcity of the rarity of encounters in the first place, potentially. And cultural reasons, that it may have just been not. We have plenty of analogies in human history of incoming populations meeting indigenous populations where, yes, some interbreeding takes place, but it's relatively, maybe very small percentages. Even with the work that's been done on the genetics with the MIT DNA, and as well as nucleus, some of it, all that proves is that they can't find anything left today of Neanderthal genes in populations left today. It doesn't absolutely prove that no Neanderthals and no modern humans ever had sex way back 40,000 years ago. There just isn't any genetic definite evidence that they did. That's all so far. Because I'm arguing with these cosmetic signals, I think there's a strong possibility, which is really backed up by some of that Chaperoonian evidence, that moderns and Neanderthals could indeed have met and read each other's signals. And there are certain sites, the Romanian site, the Oaje de Pescare, the site where there is one of the very oldest dated moderns that have been found in Europe, which would be the populations that really were coming into contact with Neanderthals for the first time. And there are indications of Neanderthal diagnostic features in some of those fossils. There's a huge warfare going on amongst the archaeologists and the fossil people on this point at the moment. I can't pretend to adjudicate that, but I think there is, I would not rule out certainly having sex, whether they had many surviving offspring, and whether those offspring could really reproduce successfully. There may have been reasons why not. On the question of Neanderthals and language, if Neanderthals had language, that implies Homo heidelbergensis of 500,000 and 600,000 years ago, like a Bodo from Ethiopia, for instance, had language. I disagree. I think that if you're following Homo heidelbergensis of 500,000 or 600,000 years ago would have had very many capacities already there that would have enabled language to be used as a communication system if Homo heidelbergensis' societal system was ready for it. To the extent that Homo heidelbergensis was beginning to engage with ritually structured sexual division of labor, and I think that could have been happening 400,000, 300,000 years ago, as soon as you've got anything like female cosmetic coalitions going on, and remember that I'm only counting when you've actually got the evidence of the pigment. This could be happening on an impromptu basis before we ever see any pigment for long time depth, potentially. If those guys are hunting big dangerous animals, mammoths, 400,000 years ago, when you talk to Jerome about hunting an elephant, trying to hunt elephant together as a collective group of, his forest people, the Mengele, they have to be able to talk. They have to be able to do rituals together that mean they understand each other. They know what each other's going to do in those incredibly dangerous conditions. And if they are trusting each other that much, they're going to be able to speak to each other. So you could imagine a model of language emerging both in the ancestry of Neanderthals and in the ancestry of modern humans in the period 400,000, when already those populations have gone divergent. I don't see why not. We're at the same pushes, the same driving forces of encephalization and the requirements of sexual division of labor will be in place. So coming back to Hughes with Robin Dunbar, I profoundly disagree with Robin Dunbar's view that language comes first and drives ritual. With Chris's arguments and this prototype of ritual activity, we strongly argue we have to establish trust amongst ritual coalitions for the linguistic capacities to then flow into performance, to be able to start talking to each other, to be able to trust each other, because linguistic signals are just too easy to be used to lie. We're too Machiavellian intelligent. We'd use those cheap signals to lie unless we have ways of forming the costly signals of commitment and bonding with each other. And above all, it's the question of male competition. You know, the hunting, you say we're guilty of making this all-encompassing idea. I agree, but I think it's a good one, because a human revolution surely has to be explaining the revolution that goes through the whole society, that is going to enable the trust that enables language, that's going to enable to construct kinship systems, that's going to enable the economic exchange, that's going to enable all the capacities for flexibility and innovation in technological terms. So, we just say ritual first, not language first. As soon as the ritual's there, the language flows. It's going to happen. You can't derive, Marx says, language agitated layers are there. You can't derive material economic factors. You can't tell men, right, off you go, dears, go hunting, by little words. Especially if those men are worried that if they go off hunting, some other cheat, philanderer, is going to hang about the camp and sniff out the menstruating or ovulating females. They're not going to... only when you have overcome the difficulties of competition can you afford to leave camp altogether and go and hunt that mammoth. You can't do it otherwise. You're too worried about watching your back with your pair-born partner. Alistair, sorry, your question was good about culture and biology. The time frames, yeah, sure. With the langur example, which is so remarkable, because in one species we've got this variability, we really don't know enough about how they do that at this stage. I mean, it's you can put, you need to start doing things like that. In the case of I have no doubt at all, menstruation was a very present and significant signal with the ancestor of both us and Neanderthals. It's likely to be there for all kinds of phylogenetic reasons. I'm not really proposing that Neanderthals actually bred out the signal, because they may have had phylogenetic constraints. They couldn't necessarily have done that. They would have used other means to hide it through clothes. I mean, if you really want to hide it, you could.
So the issue is how you behave when it comes. Either you spread it out and show it off, or
that's the key point. But I'm sure the Neanderthals would have had cultural means to overcome those things, to work that out. There was the burials bit. Yeah, I didn't touch on the burials controversies. The most interesting places to compare the burials is the Middle East, where there's so many of the same actual sites, with Skull Kafsa and then the Almud and Kibara and so forth. Of course, Skull Kafsa is pretty... Now, the Skull Kafsa burials are modern human burials that are much older than Neanderthal burials that come in the same area about 50,000 years later, mostly. And those in school kafsa, modern human burials, there is, well, one, there's ochre, red ochre being used. Two, there's shells, the shell beads being put in there. So those are some of the earliest, actually outside of Africa, with cultural artifacts like shells. And animal grave goods like animal bones placed in significant places. Now, there's been a huge controversy that certain Neanderthal burials appear to have symbolic components, but nearly always they've been rubbished. I'm a little suspicious of the fact that Neanderthals, there's no question they're doing these deliberate burials, and from a time period as old, at least, as modern humans. There are cases where it really looks like they're doing something with their dead, more than merely burying them, disposing of them as kind of a loved one, somebody cared for. But nobody's ever been able to absolutely say this is for sure symbolic in the burial grave goods. Also, there's an unusual lack, and compared to the modern humans, there's nearly consistently there's pigment and ochre, whereas Neanderthals I wish they would tell us more about some of those burials in the Middle East. I bet there might be some ochre there that maybe people haven't talked about, because a lot of this archaeological record I'm showing is people have hardly started to look at the Neanderthal pigment record. I'm trying to put up a model that's saying, look for it there, there, and there, in those sites, and then you can test it. On the question of out of Africa, Middle Stone Age, modernity, and you're putting up a contentious point of view to say that, oh, they had a flash in the pan revolution in Africa, and then it kind of disappeared. Yeah, it kind of disappears because, well, the population in Africa, of course, it hits the oncoming ice age when archaeological visibility all goes. People disappear. Partly the people are disappearing, some of them disappear outside of Africa because maybe it's getting very, very cold, very, very dry in large areas where those central modern human populations were, so they're moving elsewhere. I would say that there is never any break in continuity. I mean, we do have sort of Howisson's Port, Middle Stone Age, which is about 70,000 years ago, beautiful, sophisticated tool technology. And then there kind of seems to be a bit of a disappearing act of any real sexy symbolic stuff in Africa. You've always got the pigment. That's always running through. It never disappears, which is like the signature. And of course, if you look at, well, you get late LSA, which is already coming in with continuity for Bushman cultures today, practically. That's going back 25, 30,000. And of course, the old position used to be, Africa was incredibly backward. They didn't get their Upper Paleolithic until about 25. The Upper Paleolithic in Europe from 40,000 was the great symbolic explosion. Europeans did it first. The Africans were incredibly backward until about 20,000 years ago. And that position has so been turned on its head that I wouldn't like to go down the road of proposing that they lost it in Africa and get... But probably the population went very thin. They may have been...
sort of 40, 50,000, so it's
yeah.
not the same as the...
It is really. Well, Rift Valley, ostrich eggshell and so forth is really showing the same time period. Rodeo, what else have I got to say? Anne had some questions about cultural strategies and rodeo riders are absolutely not. There's no question, probably for the reasons of those energetics that those archaeologists are arguing. I love that model with Robrook's archaeology, energetics. If what counts for the Neanderthals is not making fancy tools and curating beautiful upper pal blades and stuff like that. What counts for the Neanderthals is their knowledge of how to find the animals quickly, because they want to get to the animals quickly before they have to walk all over the place. They want to know how to track. They want to read the animals' minds. They're following a different type of foraging strategy in those senses. And yeah, there's no question, they're getting up and close and personal with those animals. But it's not because they're stupid or anything like that. It's because that works better for them and they're getting their kilocalories through doing that. Yeah, which of course can't, I mean, it can't really be true, but there may be real reasons for Neanderthal populations dying out because life history parameters were under severe stress, if you're getting a lot of adults dying relatively young, then this is much more likely to be reasons for Neanderthal extinction. So I don't, with Anne's question, I don't think that this cosmetic strategy is not this. The fact that they're kind of dropping it and then taking it up again, dropping it and taking it up again, is not because they're stupid and they can't work it out. It's because they're able to do their strategies without having to bother with all that. But when it starts happening again, then they kind of have to they're just handicapped by having not had the same pressures pushing them all the way through that the modern humans had as a regularity. Now, what you'd asked was a very good question. Why didn't the modern humans, when they came into the northern European environments, why didn't they then suddenly sort of start going back, forget about their culture? My answer to that is that by the time of modern human speciation, with the sort of explosion of this, he doesn't necessarily agree with that, but explosion of ritual activity, pigment use, plus the other things that we are picking up traces of in Africa, it's gone to a cultural level. It's gone to a level where it's no longer climate-driven, and it's all. And I would argue that's being driven by I was stressing sexual selection factors. Basically, you're never going to go back from that. But it probably took until the order of 50, 60,000 years ago before, and it seems to have been with the manganese. For whatever reason, the male Neanderthals were going for the black manganese, the little black dress, like you're saying. Derrico has argued about that well, black Neanderthals presumably had fairer skins than us, being Northern European origin. Fairer skins than, I'm saying us, so I've got a freckly Neanderthal skin here, fairer skins than my immediate ancestors coming from and so black looks smart on fair skin, but I don't quite agree with Derrico, because I don't see why red doesn't. I've used both red and black body paint, I don't see why not. However, there's something that's triggered the black, and for some reason they're always a bit dodgy.
Could this be an overlap with humans come?
Yeah,
might they be seeing these black humans arriving and thinking there's
by the time modern humans, I mean, I think we've got to be a little. By the time modern humans get all the way round into Europe, I'd say they're going to be. Yeah, they're going to be coffee Ethiopia. They're not going to be black equatorial. They're going to be coffee Ethiopia. They're going to be darker skinned than Neanderthals, but kind of they're coming from an area like Pakistan. So.
That was a flippant point, really.
But no, it may not be. It may not be.
To come in to conclude now.
I'm going to conclude. Right. Thank you to John for raising this point about it's like a sequence of different events of a revolutionary process. So we're seeing this kind of revolution as a strategy which can be repeated and performed, or maybe then not performed and therefore maybe just left aside before it becomes again utilised. And I'd highlight this factor, which I think would be a very important factor behind things like species interbreeding, of Darwinian motors such as sexual selection being the ones that are critical for driving, whether it's speciation in mind, whether it's through cultural factors of speciation. This would be the kind of critical process. So you could get revolutionary activities that are just kind of cropping up as kind of temporary picket lines, but then it all goes, the struggle dies down again and you don't get anything going on before maybe then the people Neanderthal females are forced back into doing some more cosmetic strategies. It does really look overall to me as though there were periods where Neanderthals, at least in certain regions, like Neanderthals in France and the Mysterian sequences that we have very good detail on, there really were some take-off points going on. And I would side with the archaeologists who are very kind of, they fight against speciesist discrimination against Neanderthals. They say, look, Neanderthal culture from the Châtelperronian has an autonomous quality. It looks like Neanderthals are doing things differently, even if the modern human contact stimulates them. Well, of course it stimulates them. You're suddenly coming up with a completely new people in your same space. Is there going to be competition between those species for resources? Yes, it's very likely that there is. For the Neanderthal populations back through long time periods, that they've always been a bit on the edge. That environment they're dealing with in Europe, glacial Europe, that they're constantly being pushed back out of and going back into. This would be one of the most difficult environments that any human species was ever dealing with. And they were incredibly able to deal with it. But of course, Neanderthals were also living in other areas, such as Middle Eastern, particularly when climate got very considerably colder and they would move down south again. This model is useful because it makes these testable predictions. For instance, shouldn't we be finding more symbolic materials in Middle Eastern sites where Neanderthals are encountering rather more African-like climate conditions, perhaps? Neanderthals may always have been a bit. All you have to do is have one species with a small birth rate advantage compared to Neanderthals. I think there are good reasons to think that in life that Neanderthals came up under a lot of stress, so that they